Hello, it's Pastor Marleen Griffith-Stahl again, returning with another Bible study on Exodus. We're looking at Exodus chapters 14 and 15 today, and I do encourage you always to read them either before or after you listen to this. But we left, the Israelites have finally been able to leave Egypt. They've left behind their slavery because of that terrible last plague. Um, Pharaoh has said, "Go, be on your way." And on their way out, they have this gold and silver from the Egyptian people, and they're carrying only what they can. They didn't even have enough time to bake the bread right, so they're having their flatbread. They've had their Passover lamb. Their firstborn children were saved, and their firstborn cattle were saved, and they've been able to leave, and God is leading them. And God leads them by way that is not um, on major trade routes. We're in the Sinai Peninsula now, so if you want to take a look at a map, you end up kind of towards the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula eventually. But when you're being let out, one of the first things that happens is you get right up against the Red Sea. Now, the Red Sea is rather large, and where this happens, nobody knows for sure, but most people say this is probably taking place on one of those kind of little finger pieces that come up from the Red Sea. So if you look at one of the maps, you'll see there's kind of a large body of the Red Sea, and then there's kind of these two little sections that are thinner, and that's where we think this crossing would have taken place. Who knows? And of course, there's a lot of people who don't believe that's necessarily an historical event. Um, and I'm not worried about that. What I'm worried about is what does it say about our faith and God delivering us from trouble and from all the things that bring about death instead of life. And Pharaoh and his rule is definitely bringing about death. And here the Israelites are finally freed from Pharaoh's rule. Because despite the fact that Pharaoh, at you know, uh, and 2 or 3 chapters earlier said, "Go, be on your way. I just want you out of here." Pharaoh's heart is hardened once again in the beginning of chapter 14, and the Israelites are being pursued by Pharaoh and his chariots. And of course, if you've got a group of people walking and Pharaoh and his military forces are behind you in chariots, they're going to catch up to you pretty quickly. It doesn't take a genius to know who's going to win that race. So the Israelites, of course, find themselves um, on one side with uh, Pharaoh and the chariots coming, and they know they're coming, and this pillar of cloud in between them to kind of protect them a little bit by God. And then right in front of them is the Red Sea. And they're not all proficient swimmers. They're not all going to swim across the Red Sea. And certainly the cattle and all the livestock aren't going to swim across the Red Sea. So they don't know what they're going to do. And their first response is what you will hear over and over again in Exodus in this story is the people grumble. They start complaining to Moses and they say, "Why did you lead us out here? Weren't there any graves in Egypt? If we're going to die, we could have at least died there and not tried to get over here." They've already forgotten that God has protected them from many of these plagues that were brought about. God has protected them from the worst of the plagues. Their firstborn children are safe and sound with them, and yet they grumble that God has obviously brought them out to die, and how much better it was when they were in Egypt. Well, obviously, it wasn't better when they were in Egypt. Their memories are short, like some of us when things go badly. But when they're faced with the Red Sea and they don't know what to do, the night is starting to pass. And as I said, God puts this dark cloud in between the Egyptians and the Israelites. You'll see it kind of moves the pillar of cloud that's been leading them, becomes kind of this dark cloud to keep them at least a little bit safe, slow down the Egyptians a little bit. And it's during that time that we hear what Moses does. God tells him to take that staff, stretch it out over the Red Sea, and hold it out. And the wind blows up, and over the course of the night, the waters part and the Egyptians cross over on dry land. And you know this story. You know the story of the crossing of the Red Sea. So just imagine what it might have been like to have a wall of sea on your left and your right and walking on dry land throughout. And of course, as soon as they get over, the Egyptians are already starting to follow them. And it's when all of the Israelites get over that Moses crosses and puts the staff down, and the waters come raging back in. But not before the Egyptians are, and the chariots are already in the sea. And so they're captured in the sea, and that is the end of this Egyptian Pharaoh and his people. Well, at least his forces. I'm pretty sure in Egypt they find a new Pharaoh pretty quickly, and things continue, but without a lot of slave labor. They lost most of their labor force for building at this point. But it is a time of celebration for the Hebrew people. And so, chapter 15 is really a song. And you can imagine them singing and dancing and joyful because they did cross over safely. And they watched horse and rider be thrown into the sea. And they watched God definitively take care of, destroy their enemies. And so we have an image that Miriam's the one that leads the people, and that's, of course, Moses and Aaron's sister. And she sings and they dance and they play music. And you can just imagine the tambourines and everybody dancing and joyful that day. And at the end of the chapter, though, they have to contend with what they're going to do at this point because now they've crossed over. They're singing, they're dancing, they're cheerful. But then at the end of the chapter, they're already faced with their next struggle because even though they're free, they couldn't carry enough water with them. They couldn't carry enough food with them. So they're already going to start complaining about not having in its first water. And then we'll hear food in chapter 16 the next time. But at the end of, after the great song and dance and the great celebration, we hear that they go to Mara where the water is bitter. And of course, they cry out to Moses, we don't have anything to drink now. And God tells Moses what to do. And Moses is able to throw, it's a special, he shows him this tree and throws a stick into it. The water becomes sweet, which is a way of saying the water was safe to drink at that point. I don't recommend it as a way of purifying your water if you're out hiking, though. Don't just pick out any particular stick and throw it in. I think a water filter would be much safer. But, miraculously, this water is taken care of. So once again, we see God providing exactly what they need when they need it. And yet they keep crying out to Moses, not sure that God's going to provide for them when they need it. And unfortunately, you hear that throughout most of Exodus, not certain that God's going to provide for them. And in our moments when we're not certain that God's going to provide, I hope we remember stories like this. Remember that God does provide for God's people, and I trust God always will. Sometimes it seems like it's taking too long. Sometimes we get impatient and we start to grumble and murmur just like the Israelites did. But I hope in the end you trust that your Creator, who loves you and sustains us as a world, will provide what we need and always does. Thanks for listening.